So I certainly wasn't expecting to do this on a random Wednesday in October, but Marco Andretti has announced his retirement from racing, as well, of course, from the Indianapolis 500. So in this video, we're going to eulogize his career, talk about his career, because it is a fascinating one, despite the fact that there's not as much success as I think was prophesized when he came into IndyCar racing in 2006. There were people who thought he was going to be the next American driver in Formula One. He was going to be a multiple time Indianapolis 500 winner. The expectations were so high for Marco Andretti, and he never reached those. But I think a lot of people are also unfair about his career a little bit. So we'll talk about that in this video, as well as the implications for what this may mean for Andretti Global going forward, as well as what might happen to that fourth Andretti seat at the Indianapolis 500, because all of a sudden there's a hell of a seat available for a driver who might be out of a ride. Well, I guess we'll talk about that here in a second. DL 500 Club tonight at 8 p.m. if you want to talk to me live over on Patreon about anything in racing that you'd like to talk about, or really anything in general if you want to talk to me about. We also filmed a really cool feature with Arrow McLaren team principal Tony Kanaan yesterday at the new Arrow McLaren shop, which ironically enough is the former Andretti Global race shop where many of Marco Andretti's race cars came out of. Going to be editing that here in the next couple of days and get that out to you. It's really cool. Tony, obviously a very good person to hear from, and there were no shortage of stories from Tony Kanaan. So I think it's a really cool feature that we've got coming on this channel here in the off season. So let's take a look at Marco's statement that he put out on social media today. To my friends, family, team, sponsors, and fans who have genuinely supported me for the last 30 years in motorsport, I want to thank you for allowing me the privilege to continue our family's passion on the racetrack. I've had some really fun times behind the wheel in a lot of different types of race cars, a lot of great memories as well, mostly at the Indy 500. Today, I am announcing my retirement from motor racing and the Indianapolis 500. That totals 20 starts at the Speedway, which I feel so fortunate to be able to say. That is ranked 12th all time. Not bad for a 38-year-old. I am proud of my overall stats at the Indy 500. I had 6 very legitimate shots at victory with Andretti Autosport and ended up with 20% top 3 finishes at the Speedway. It feels accomplishing to me to be able to retire having more podium finishes than my father Michael, and the same as my grandfather Mario at the biggest race in the world. I will never forget the rare circumstance of getting to race my dad in the closing laps for the win there, the pressure of participating in the dramatic bump day in 2011 to a pole position in 2020. That's what the Indianapolis 500 produces. Extremes on both sides, or maybe as Paul Page would say, emotions on both ends of the spectrum. That is why I love and appreciate it so much. I am very much at peace with the next chapter in my life. After dedicating 3 decades to the sport, I will be prioritizing most of my time on being a great father to my daughter, Miura, and tending to my other business ventures. I am also coming out with a memoir about my life, Defending the Dynasty. Details coming soon on that. That's going to be cool. Looking forward to reading that, Marco. 2006 to 2025. Competing at the top level of North American motorsports has always been an honor for me, even in the tough times. That is where I can look back and say I have made the best progress in life as a man. Learning to navigate very difficult dynamics at times and others doubting me made me realize that my opinion of myself is the one that should matter the most. Lastly, a special thank you to a lot of the people I respect in motor racing for the kind words about my driving, work ethic, and true character. Marco Andretti. So, this is sad. I mean, on a personal note, before we kind of get into the many of the stats and figures that Marco brought up in his kind of farewell speech there, outside of the 1996 to 2000 split period, there has been an Andretti consistently in the Indy 500 field since Mario arrived at the Speedway in 1965. There was one other year, I think it was 1978, that Mario missed a race, or maybe it was 79. It was 79 that Mario missed the 500 due to being the defending Formula One world champion. But outside of that, consistently, since 1965, there has at least been a chance of an Andretti participating as a driver at the Indianapolis 500. And 2026 is going to be the first year where that just isn't a thing. And what a changing of an era, I would say. I don't think that's overstatement. And yes, Marco in recent years has not been the competitive Andretti that we've expected to see at the 500 for my entire lifetime. The first 500 I was alive for, 1994, was Mario's last. Michael obviously was a perennial contender at the Indianapolis 500 when he was there, of course, if you don't count the split years. And then Marco at the very beginning of his career, and even towards the end of it, was very competitive at the Indy 500. And I suppose we'll talk about the Indy 500 record first, because Marco obviously made a big deal about it, and it is a big deal. And you look back at 2006, that Indy 500, and that incredible, Marco mentioned it, being able to pass his dad for the Indy 500 lead, and what would have been for the win. And you think about that pass on a late race restart, I remember it very well, having been there. And it was a yellow towards the end of the race. I think it was Felipe Giafoni got into the wall or something. And it's kind of sad, actually, because I think Michael probably would have won the race had it gone green to the end on fuel mileage. He had a tremendous lead. But you obviously didn't realize that at the time, because it was kind of in the middle of a cycle of pit stops, and you didn't really know where everybody was positioned on the racetrack. And then when the field packs up and the first car behind the pace car is the number one Vonage car, and you're like, holy smokes, Michael's leading? But then on the restart, Marco passes Michael. And you finally had a situation, you obviously had Michael and Mario race each other. You had Big Al and Little Al race each other. Fathers and sons have raced each other at the Indy 500 before. But that was the first time where a son passed a father essentially for the win. And then Sam Hornish arrived on the scene. But Marco really, and it sucks to say, because, hindsight is 2020, but Marco, when he blocked Hornish going into turn 3, cut his nose off essentially, Marco had the race won. And Marco was very conservative on the last lap. If you watch his lines, he was way off of the wall, trying to, save, not take any risks. And in doing so, allowed Sam Hornish to close and ultimately pass him before the start-finish line, and kind of steal away the 2006 Indianapolis 500. And you look at Marco and his expression after that race, and unfortunately, it kind of set the tone. And you knew it set, and I think everybody in that building knew it set the tone, right? Everybody who was in attendance for that race, who was watching it on television or saw it, later on, and then saw Marco Andretti's expression as he got out of the car. He had that look of like, oh no, I'm cursed too, right? Which is a shame, because he drove an incredibly good race in 2006. And then you go back to 2007. Yes, he ended the race upside down. But if you watch that race back, Marco's driving with incredible confidence. He drives right up through the field. I think when the rain came around lap 100, he was running second behind Tony Kanaan. Obviously, as things worked out, he ended up on his lid, flipping over on the back straightaway, and Dario ended up winning it. But that was a weird race anyway with rain. 2008, again, super, super strong. Arguably could have won that race as well in what I think is the best livery of all time ever, the Indiana Jones livery, the best sponsorship tie-in ever, too. I think Marco has always said that they made a wing adjustment on the last pit stop, and that's kind of what prevented him from really taking a run at Dixon towards the end of that race. But he still finished third. And things started to kind of fall apart in 2009. He had a crash on the first lap with Mario Moraes, and he really never got a chance to show what he could or could not have done in that race. And then 2010 and 2011 were years where Andretti really struggled with qualifying. Obviously, he had to deal with bump day in 2011, but he wasn't very fast in 2010 either. And those cars just weren't anywhere close in 2010 and 2011. 2012 with the DW12, I believe he ended up leading the most laps in the 500, ultimately was taken out in a crash. But Marco really probably could have won 2012. 2013 was another really strong year for Marco. Again, kind of a head scratcher as why he wasn't really in the mix towards the end of the race. And Tony Kanaan ended up winning that race. 2014, if I remember correctly, I think that the crew made some sort of a mistake with tire pressures on the last pit stop. He was running at the front, was in contention to win with Elio Castroneves and Ryan Hunter-Reay, ultimately again finishing in the third spot. 2015, Marco was competitive, and had the Honda Aero kit been a little bit better, I think we would have been talking about him being a contender for victory in 2015. But if you didn't have a Chevy that year, you really weren't you weren't in good shape. And then things started to fall off a little bit. He still had the pace. Obviously, Andretti was super strong in 16, 17, 18, 19. He had a terrible year. And then there was the bizarre 2020 year where Marco qualifies on the pole and there's no one there to celebrate it. The adulation that Marco probably would have received for being the Indy 500 pole sitter, he didn't get it. He didn't get the cheers of the crowd. He didn't get nearly as much hype with that race being bizarre, no fans, and in the middle of August, right? And then ultimately, he doesn't even lead going across the line. Scott Dixon beats him to the yard of bricks, and Marco doesn't lead a single lap in his only Indy 500 pole win. And as the years went on, he became less and less competitive. A crash in the last 2 years. In fact, while it wasn't technically on lap one, it was the first racing lap of the race. Marco's in the wall in turn one, and ultimately that's where his Indy 500 career ends. But if you look at his competitiveness as well in the series as a whole, really wasn't all that bad. Yes, I think he's better than his 2-win record would indicate. I'll put it that way. I think he should have won at least a couple of races in 2006, not just at Sonoma. He probably should have won Watkins Glen. He was taken out by Eddie Cheever in the long Italian feud between Cheevers and Andretti's, which is quite interesting. A lot of hand gestures going on there. But he should have won that race. And 07, 08, you were kind of scratching your head as to why he wasn't winning. 2011 had a great win at Iowa. 2013, I think Marco should have had 4 or 5 wins that year. Quite frankly, should have competed for the championship. He certainly should have won the first race back at Pocono. It was ultimately a fuel mileage miscalculation on Andretti's part, and Ganassi didn't have that. And Ganassi was less thirsty, and they ultimately won a race that was dominated by Marco Andretti. And 2014, there, and I think there was another, what was it, a Detroit race where Marco had a really great run. I think it was 2017. Ultimately, not Mario Marias. Why am I forgetting? Carlos Munoz ended up winning that race. There we go. I don't know why I was thinking of Mario Marias, but Carlos Munoz won that race. Marco was second. And you think back to 2019 Detroit and an incredible outlap Marco did on slicks on a wet racetrack, which is still goes viral every 2 years. You think about Marco's SRX championship. He jumps in a stock car and he beats a bunch of stock car guys. He won a race at Slinger Speedway of all places, right? Like, that was pretty cool. Marco was extremely good in ALMS in 2008 when he drove the Acura ARX-01 for the family team. He should have probably been on the overall pole at Sebring one year. Damn near took the lead going into turn one. Ultimately, there was a bit of a jam up, and he ended up in the dirt. I think he's one of the few drivers that's taken Road Atlanta flat out because they were making so much downforce in those days. He did a double header one time with ALMS and IndyCar. I think he did Lime Rock and then flew to Iowa, which was insane behavior. And some people have wondered if, Marco had kind of pursued the sports car thing a little bit earlier, what might have ended up happening. And then, of course, his Formula One, I think he had a couple of tests for Honda. Never really ended up going anywhere. I think there was a lot of hype about Marco in Formula One. I know Mario certainly thought that Marco was going to be able to make that happen, and ultimately it didn't end up happening. But I think that, people gave Marco a hell of a hard time, and I understand why, and I think Marco even understood why. That was not an easy task to live with, to be thrust into the sport as a third-generational driver behind Mario Andretti, one of the greatest of all time, and Michael Andretti, one of the greatest of all time. And you have that expectation. It's not even a generational skip. If Michael hadn't been Michael, if Michael had Marco's career, and then Marco comes in and does what Marco did, it wouldn't be I don't think there would be as much pressure. But, yeah, I don't know. And the other thing about Marco is you never hear a bad thing about Marco. Like, yeah, people shit on Marco, right? But from a personal perspective, from a professional standpoint, as Marco even himself said, he's kept his nose pretty clean. And there's not a lot of horror stories about Marco, and most people who know him personally in this sport have good things to say about him. And I think in this sport where there are some characters, we'll put it, to have that kind of fame and still have some, still have a few humble bones in your body, despite the fact that he hangs out with rock stars and rappers and every big, race car driver in the world, right? But like Marco is that guy. And so I think we all wish him luck. Like I said, I grew up, an inherited Andretti fan. My dad was a big Michael fan, and so I obviously inherited that a little bit, cheered for Michael in kart. And so when Marco came up, the Andretti family was important. And it's going to be weird to not see that name on the entry list anymore, for sure. And so but we wish Marco the best. I'm looking forward to reading his memoir. I think that's going to be pretty cool. And I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what insights he has. And now I suppose we look to the future, a future that does not include the Andretti name at the Indy 500 or possibly even in the series, because I think there's definitely some smoke to this idea that the Andretti name might phase out of Andretti Global. You see a much heavier emphasis on the TWG group. Wouldn't be surprised to see that team start to be referred to as TWG Global or TWG Motorsport, not Andretti Global. Michael Andretti was attached in a rumor to Prema and then denied that was happening. So I think that, especially now that Marco's stepping away from the cockpit, we might really see a separation of that name from that team, which is certainly going to be different. I think Marco is still a part owner of the 98 car. I'm not sure exactly what that deal is going to look like now that Marco's no longer a competitor or a driver in that car. But I think it lends some interesting thoughts about what might happen with the fourth Andretti Global car. I suppose we'll call it still the fourth Andretti Global car for next year's Indianapolis 500. Announced this week, Colton Herta will be driving for Wayne Taylor Racing in the endurance races in their Cadillac GTP car, which makes you kind of scratch your head and go, wait a second, okay, Colton's not just doing Formula 2 stuff and Formula 1 prep. He's still staying in the TWG family. And I understand that Colton came out when he announced his Formula 2 ride, or that he was stepping away from IndyCar, that he was stepping away from IndyCar, right? Like there wasn't necessarily an Indy 500 run plan. However, the month of May is open on the Formula 2 schedule, and now all of a sudden there's an open seat at Andretti Global for the Indy 500. It's also a car, by the way, that's not only partly owned by Marco Andretti, it's partly owned by Brian Herta. I think I should throw that out there too. So, does this open the door for Colton Herta to make an Indy 500 run? I would have told you last week that hell no, it wasn't. But now I'm wondering about that. If it's not Marco, there's a couple other names that I could think of to throw out there that would make some sense. Depending on whether or not Ryan Hunter-Reay returns to Dreyer and Reinbold Racing, there's all sorts of rumors about that or where he might go if it's not Dreyer and Reinbold. I can tell you this, that he was attached to a Dreyer and Reinbold car last month, but last month is last month, and things have gone a little bit quiet there. There's been some rumors to suggest Ryan Hunter-Reay might be headed to a fourth car at Arrow McLaren for next year for the 500, but, do you want to get the band back together and put him at Andretti Global? Maybe. That could be an interesting possibility. And I suppose I'll throw this also out there because, again, money's no object for TWG, right? Like, they can, if they have a wish list, they can probably go get that driver. So you've got to have, be a driver that can either contend for the win or give the team value. And so you look at a Colton Herta for something like that. Obviously, that would be a huge story. Or Ryan Hunter-Reay, a driver who's previously won the Indianapolis 500, and you could potentially line up 3 former 500 winners and a driver who very soon may win a 500, and Kyle Kirkwood at that team. I'll throw another name out there. When we speak about getting the band back together, depending on whether or not he ends up in a Dreyer Reinbold car or ends up full-time somewhere else, Connor Daly would make a lot of sense. Connor's friends with Marco, and if if Marco still has a bit of a say in what goes on with that 98 car, it wouldn't surprise me to see Connor get a shot at the number 98 car for the Indy 500 next year. So those are just some thoughts. Haven't heard anything. Obviously, this is kind of brand new information. But yeah, it's interesting to see that car now go back up on the board. And we'll see what will happen at the Indy 500 this year when there is an Andretti-less year, the first year since 2000. Well, I guess 2005, too. There wasn't an Andretti. You forget about 2005 a lot of the time because there was a year, 2004 and 2005. There was a year without an Andretti because Michael didn't race in 04, didn't race in 05, then in 06. So we've lived this before, but it's weird. It's weird. It's going to be very weird, but we wish Marco Andretti all the success in the world in retirement. Thank you guys for listening to me talk about history and talk about the Indy 500. I've enjoyed that. Tony Kanaan video coming very soon. DL 500 Club tonight. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. We'll see you in the next video.